A young princess, just 14 years old, embarked on a journey that would take her from her homeland of Stettin to a distant and mysterious empire, Russia. Catherine, formerly known as Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst, little did she know that this life change would be the first step towards becoming one of the most powerful figures in history. She did not speak Russian, had little knowledge of the culture, and on top of that she was about to marry a man she knew almost nothing about, the future Emperor of Russia. Before continuing with this fascinating story, if you are enjoying this type of content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and comment below what you think of the stories of the monarchy. Russia in 1744 was not an easy place. The Russian court, with its complexities, intrigues, and rigid rules, was a challenging environment where any mistake could mean the end of a career or even one's life. However, Catherine had something that many did not: determination and a clear vision of her future. From her arrival in St. Petersburg, the young princess was confronted with a new world, full of challenges but also opportunities. Her marriage to Peter III, which would later become her first major step toward power, was an arranged union. Catherine was expected to be a good wife, obedient and silent, accepting her role as future empress without question. But she was not content with this fate. The Russian court, which seemed like a maze of rules and expectations, became the battlefield where she would begin to plot her ascension to the throne. She knew that to be more than just Peter's wife, she would need to win the hearts of the court, and even more so, the support of powerful allies, and that was precisely where Catherine excelled. Soon, the young princess devoted herself to learning the Russian language and studying the country's culture and history. Of course, this was not easy. Imagine trying to understand a people so different from anything she had ever known. But Catherine was not the type to give up. She also began to notice the weaknesses of her husband, Peter III, a weak and unpopular emperor whose erratic decisions infuriated the nobility and the people. And it was then that Catherine's plan began to take shape. She wanted not only to be Peter's wife, she wanted to be the leader of Russia. She began to gain influence, making strategic alliances within the court, and especially in the army. Catherine knew that the key to power was not just good manners or pleasing her husband, but building a solid support network. She began to surround herself with influential people, to learn more about politics, and especially to get close to the key figures in the empire. When Peter III made increasingly unpopular decisions, Catherine took advantage of the situation. She knew that if the right moment arose, she could assume power. That moment would come in 1762, but that's a story for the next topic. To understand Catherine's rise, we need to see how she not only conquered the throne, but how she defied all expectations of a woman in power, something almost unthinkable at the time. Catherine was no longer a shy and obedient princess. Over the course of her early years in Russia, she had become a strategic, cunning, and ambitious woman. Her marriage to Peter III, the future emperor, soon proved to be a loveless and disrespectful union. Peter was viewed by the court and the people as an eccentric, unpopular, and most importantly, an ineffective leader. He did not know how to govern, and to many, his decisions and actions seemed like a disaster waiting to happen. And that was when Catherine saw her opportunity. Although Peter III was initially her husband and theoretically the ruler, she soon realized that her own fate was intertwined with the future of the empire. Catherine not only focused on learning the Russian language and customs, but also began to astutely analyze politics, discovering the weaknesses of her husband's government and gaining allies among the leading members of the nobility and the army. The marriage, which seemed to be the key to the throne, became the stage for a political game full of intrigue. In 1762, Peter III made a fatal mistake. He made decisions that further angered the nobility, and especially the Russian army. Russia, which was at a delicate moment, needed a strong leader, and Peter was not that figure. Catherine, on the other hand, was gaining support from influential and well-positioned people who saw her as a more capable leader for the empire. When the right moment arrived, she did not hesitate. With the support of high-ranking military officers and important figures at court, Catherine organized a coup d'état. She deposed Peter III and without bloodshed assumed the throne of Russia. This political maneuver was brilliant, but also risky. Catherine had to deal with the enormous stress of a coup that could have failed, and she knew that her reign would only be legitimate if she quickly consolidated her power. What followed was a series of measures that ensured that Russia remained loyal to its new empress, starting with eliminating any internal resistance and taking decisive steps to stabilize the nation. This coup was not only a political victory, but it also established Catherine as an extremely influential and respected figure in history. She not only ascended the throne, but did so masterfully, destroying the possibility of Peter III returning to power and opening a new chapter in Russian history. Now Catherine the Great was ready to rule with a strategic vision that would forever alter the course of the Russian Empire. Now in power, Catherine knew that to solidify her reign and modernize Russia, more than just political stability and military success was needed. She wanted to transform the empire, making it more modern and influential, especially in the fields of arts, culture, and education. She was inspired by the Enlightenment ideas that were growing in Europe, with philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot championing reason, science, and freedom. Soon after assuming the throne, Catherine took decisive steps to modernize Russia. She initiated a series of educational reforms that were intended to bring more knowledge to the people, and especially to the nobility. She founded schools and universities, encouraging education for all, including upper-class girls, an extremely progressive idea for the time. This would help create an intellectual elite that could further drive the country's modernization. But Catherine was also attentive to the arts. She believed that a strong empire needed to have a rich culture, and the Russian court should reflect this. As a great patron, she encouraged the creation of cultural institutions and the development of museums and academies. Her most notable contribution in this field was the founding of the Hermitage, which began as a small private museum but grew to become one of the largest art museums in the world. Furthermore, Catherine surrounded herself with Enlightenment intellectuals and promoted philosophy and the ideas of freedom and reason among her advisors. Although not all of her reforms had an immediate impact, her intellectual openness was a major step towards modernizing Russia, making the empire a cultural reference point in Europe. With political and cultural stability established, Catherine knew that the next step in ensuring Russia's greatness would be to further expand the empire. Russia was already immense, but Catherine wanted to ensure that the country would be even more influential on the European and Asian scene. She believed that Russia needed more direct access to the Black Sea and more territory to become a true world power. Catherine launched a series of military campaigns, which resulted in Russian territorial expansion in various directions. One of the most notable achievements was the Russo-Turkish Wars, in which Russia, under her leadership, defeated the Ottoman Empire and acquired strategic territories in the south, including parts of the Crimea, a rich region of great military and commercial importance. The victory over the Ottomans not only secured Russia's access to the Black Sea, but also strengthened its position in Europe. Catherine also played a central role in the partition of Poland, a process that divided Polish territory between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. This movement weakened Poland, and Russia became one of the leading powers in the region. Catherine's expansion was not only a military matter, but also a strategic one. By conquering these lands, she ensured that Russia had influence over neighboring countries and thus consolidated Russian power in Europe. Catherine the Great was not only a ruler who expanded borders and reformed the empire, but also a woman who challenged the gender norms of her time. In the 18th century, Russia, like many other countries in Europe, was dominated by a patriarchal structure, where power was undoubtedly reserved for men. However, Catherine proved that women could rule with skill and authority, surpassing all expectations about the role of women in politics. From the beginning of her reign, Catherine faced a great challenge, being a woman ruling a vast empire traditionally ruled by men. She knew that it would not be enough to simply take the throne. She would need to prove that she was not just the wife of an emperor, but a natural leader, capable of leading the nation with competence and vision. And that is what she did. Catherine not only ruled with political skill, but also led a true cultural and social revolution for Russian women. She encouraged female education and women's participation in culture and the arts, something that was very rare for the time. She believed that education was the key to progress, and this philosophy applied to both men and women of the nobility. Catherine also opened schools for upper-class girls and, in some cases, promoted the idea that women could participate in intellectual debates and even hold positions in public administration, something completely innovative for her time. Furthermore, Catherine surrounded herself with influential women who helped drive her government and promote her reforms. She was a true defender of the female role in society and made a point of breaking the myth that women were not capable of exercising power as competently as men. Catherine was not a woman who allowed herself to be trapped by the traditional roles that society at the time imposed on her. She rewrote the rules of how a woman could rule, and in doing so left a lasting legacy of female power. Catherine's relationship with her husband Peter III is one of the most intriguing and controversial chapters of her life. Although the marriage between the two was a political arrangement, what actually happened between them was much more complex. Peter III was, for many, an eccentric, impulsive, and above all, unpopular man. His personality and erratic decisions made him a figure of little credibility within the Russian court, which put Catherine in an uncomfortable position. Peter III, the Tsar who was supposed to be Russia's great leader, seemed completely out of touch with the needs of the empire. He was obsessed with his homeland, Prussia, and his attempts to ally himself with this traditional enemy of Russia were not well received by his subjects. Furthermore, his lack of tact with the nobility and his selfish nature created a deep rift between him and members of his own court. Peter III also had an erratic personality that made him at times unbearable to those around him. Catherine, on the other hand, was a woman of great intelligence and political skill. From the beginning, she realized that Peter did not possess the qualities necessary to rule. But as his wife, she was in a delicate position. Throughout the years of their marriage, Catherine maintained the facade of support for her husband, but she was always aware that if she wanted to rule effectively, she would need to remove Peter from the throne. In 1762, Catherine and her court allies, such as the military commander Grigory Orlov, staged a coup d'état. Peter III was deposed without bloodshed, and although the official reason for his removal was his inefficiency as a ruler, many speculate that Catherine's dissatisfaction with her own husband was also a key factor. After being imprisoned, Peter III died mysteriously under circumstances that have never been fully clarified, but regardless, Catherine's accession to the throne was sealed. Catherine's relationship with Peter III, with all its intrigues and complexity, reflected her political pragmatism. For her, maintaining power had no room for personal weakness, and if that meant acting against her husband, she would do so without hesitation. Among the most important men in Catherine's life was Grigory Potemkin, one of her most famous lovers, and at the same time, one of the greatest political and military allies of her career. Potemkin was not only a passionate lover of Catherine, but also a brilliant strategist and politician who helped to further expand the Russian Empire. His relationship with Catherine was one of the most complex and long-lasting in the history of monarchs, marked by both love and political power. Potemkin was instrumental in the conquest of Crimea and the modernization of the administration of the new Russian provinces. He also played a vital role in military reform, promoting a modernization of the Russian armed forces and expanding Russian influence in the Black Sea, a region crucial to its naval and commercial dominance. Although his relationship with Catherine is often seen as a political affair, Potemkin had enormous influence in Catherine's government and became a central figure at court. When he died in 1791, Catherine was deeply shaken, not only because he was her lover, but also because he was her political partner. His death left a significant gap in Russian politics, and his loss was felt for a long time. Potemkin's story is not just about a man in love, but also about the impact of his actions on the empire. Together, he and Catherine changed the course of Russian history, and Potemkin's legacy, especially in the military and administrative areas, would live on long after his death. Another crucial point in Catherine's reign was the partition of Poland, an event that had profound implications not only for Russia but for the balance of power in Europe. Poland at the time was in a fragile and vulnerable political position, with an unstable system of government and an overly powerful nobility. Catherine, as part of her strategy to ensure that Russia was surrounded by vassal or allied states, used her influence to fragment Poland. Between 1772 and 1795, Poland was divided into three parts, with its lands being divided between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The partition had a devastating impact on the Polish people, who lost their independence and were absorbed by neighboring powers. Catherine, who had always sought to expand Russia and increase her influence, succeeded in achieving her goal, but this maneuver generated criticism both within and outside the empire. Many considered the partition a cruel and merciless imperialist action, and although it consolidated Russia's position, it also increased the hostility of the other European powers. However, for Catherine, this was a fundamental political move, and she knew that maintaining power would require difficult decisions. Although Catherine was an extraordinary monarch, with a vision for Russia's modernization and territorial expansion, one of the greatest challenges of her reign was the issue of serfdom. In the 18th century, serfdom was a deeply rooted institution in Russian society. The peasants, who made up the majority of the population, were essentially tied to the land, treated as property of the nobles, with no freedom or mobility rights. For many, serfdom was a form of slavery, and their living conditions were extremely harsh and precarious. Catherine, despite being influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment, which defended freedom and equality, was unable to resolve the issue of serfdom effectively. During her reign, she attempted to implement some reforms that aimed to improve the lives of serfs, but she was never able to eradicate the system, mainly because she needed the support of the nobility, who had vast lands and controlled most of the serf population. Early in her reign, Catherine attempted to introduce some laws to curb the abuses against the peasants. She wanted the nobles to treat the serfs more humanely and allow them some basic rights. However, these attempts at reform never materialized. Instead, Catherine made concessions to the nobles, giving them more power and control over their serfs, which only made the situation worse. One of the reasons Catherine failed to abolish serfdom was her need to maintain political and social stability. She knew that the nobility were essential to her power, and without their support, her rule would be at risk. The nobles, in turn, saw the peasants as cheap laborers who were necessary for agricultural production, and many resisted any kind of change that would threaten this system. Over the course of her reign, Catherine eventually gave in to pressure from the nobility and entrenched the serfdom system, which would remain one of Russia's greatest problems until the 19th. The issue of serfdom, which persisted for more than a century after Catherine's reign, would generate deep social tensions and would be one of the factors that contributed to the Russian Revolution in the early 20th century. While Catherine is remembered for her achievements in other areas, her failure to address serfdom is one of the most scathing criticisms of her rule. After ruling Russia for more than 3 decades, Catherine began to face the inevitable challenges of old age. Her health, which had previously enabled her to face the rigors of government with determination, began to decline. Although she remained active in state affairs and involved in many political decisions until the end of her life, signs of wear and tear were visible. Catherine, who had been an unbeatable figure for so long, was no longer the woman of immense energy and sharp mind who had dominated war councils and philosophical debates. She suffered from health problems, including attacks of gout and breathing difficulties. But she nevertheless strove to rule with the same strength as before. Her advisors and those close to her, though concerned, respected her determination to remain in command even as her body weakened. However, in 1796, after a reign of 34 years, Catherine passed away. She died on November 17, apparently from a stroke. Her sudden death took many by surprise, and the empire was shaken by the loss of its great leader. Catherine was buried with great pomp, but doubts about her legacy remained. She had transformed Russia in profound and complex ways, but she left unresolved issues such as serfdom and social tensions. When she died, Catherine left behind a powerful and expansive empire, but also a major dilemma for her successor, her son Paul I. Although she ruled with a clear vision of modernizing Russia, her reign was not without its critics, and the future of the empire depended on how Paul I handled the changes she had initiated. Despite the failures and challenges Catherine faced during her reign, her legacy is immense and lasting. She not only established Russia as one of the greatest military and territorial powers in Europe, but also transformed Russian culture and society. Her reign marked an era of great achievements, but also of profound contradictions. Catherine was a great reformer and strategist, capable of expanding the empire and modernizing several areas of administration. Under her rule, Russia became one of the most influential powers in Europe. She implemented reforms in the arts, education, and administration, with a great emphasis on promoting culture and knowledge. She also promoted the construction of a vast empire, incorporating territories that guaranteed Russia a prominent place on the global stage. Her influence was not limited to politics, but also to culture. The founding of the Hermitage Museum is a testament to her passion for the arts and her desire to transform Russia into a cultural hub. Catherine was also one of the first monarchs to associate herself with the Enlightenment, bringing ideas of freedom, reason, and progress to Russia, albeit in a controlled and limited way. However, Catherine's legacy is somewhat complex. While she was a champion of the arts and education, she also failed to address fundamental social issues, such as serfdom, which would continue to be a significant obstacle to Russia's progress. The lack of substantial social reforms and the perpetuation of inequality would contribute to tensions that would lead to revolution in the 20th. Catherine the Great remains a fascinating historical figure whose visionary leadership, courage, and political skill shaped the destiny of a nation for generations. Her reign, though full of achievements, also revealed the limitations of a monarchy that was unable or unwilling to address the deepest social issues of its time. In addition to her political prowess, one of the most talked about aspects of Catherine the Great's life was her relationships with several lovers throughout her reign. Although many praised her for her strong character and the way she governed competently, her love life has always been a subject of curiosity, scandal, and speculation. However, it is important to note that her relationships were not just matters of personal pleasure. Many of these men had a significant impact on Russian government and politics. The most famous of these lovers was Grigory Potemkin, to whom we have already referred, and with whom Catherine maintained a very close relationship both on a personal and political level. Potemkin, in addition to being a lover, became a great political ally, playing a crucial role in Russia's territorial expansions and military reforms. However, he was not the only one. Over the years, Catherine had other lovers, many of whom also became influential figures in her court. Catherine always used her relationships with these men strategically, securing her position and cementing powerful alliances. These lovers often became members of the government and helped implement her reforms, especially in the military and administrative fields. However, this aspect of her life was widely criticized, especially by those who saw these relationships as a way to consolidate her personal power and secure political support, rather than maintaining stability in the marital and family principles of the monarchy. Although Catherine's treatment of her lovers generated controversy and gossip, she was always an extremely pragmatic woman. She knew how to use these relationships to strengthen her position, but she also used them to keep the court under control and ensure that her political plans were carried out. She often fell in love with these men, but more often than not, what prevailed was the need to ensure her rise to power and the maintenance of that power. Catherine was not a traditional monarch. While female figures in the past were often restricted to passive roles, she distinguished herself by making bold decisions that included not only political reforms, but also the way she handled her personal life. Her ability to navigate the intricate web of personal and political relationships made her an even more complex and imposing figure in Russian history. Gregory Potemkin was more than just a lover. He was one of the pillars upon which Catherine built her expanding empire. He played a vital role in the formation of modern Russia, being instrumental in the incorporation of Crimea and in several successful military campaigns. But Potemkin's legacy is not limited to the military. When he became Catherine's advisor, he not only helped reform the structure of the Russian army, but was also responsible for creating an administrative system that helped integrate the new provinces into the empire. Potemkin was responsible for the construction of several cities, especially in the Crimea region, and for the founding of several strategic military fortifications along the empire's borders. His work in Crimea, in particular, was a true masterpiece of strategic planning. He not only organized the conquest of the territory, but also attempted to reform it in accordance with the Enlightenment ideas that Catherine promoted, creating a network of settlements and cities that would be the basis for Russia's economic and military growth in the region. Potemkin's impact was not limited to the administrative and military spheres. His relationship with Catherine was one of the most remarkable in the history of monarchy. Although many saw him as a lover and ally, his relationship with the Empress was far from personal. Together, they shaped Russia, and their partnership helped propel the empire to new heights of power and prestige. Potemkin's death in 1791 was a heavy blow to Catherine. He was more than a lover, he was a friend and ally, someone she trusted to carry out her political ambitions. His death left a power vacuum, and without him, Catherine had to adjust to new circumstances, seeking new alliances and facing challenges that had previously been softened by Potemkin's presence. Catherine's health began to decline slowly in the last years of her reign. Although she continued to rule with strength and dedication, the Empress began to face the physical difficulties of age. She suffered from various illnesses, including gout and heart problems, which made her less physically active, but Catherine's sharp mind continued to lead the empire. However, in 1796, after 34 years of reign, the great Empress passed away. Her sudden death, apparently caused by a stroke, came as a shock to the empire. Catherine, who had ruled Russia with a steady hand, died at the age of 67, leaving behind a great empire but also a series of unresolved issues. Her death also marked the end of an era. Catherine had transformed Russia from a growing empire into a global power. But the empire she left behind was not free from internal tensions, such as the issue of serfdom and growing inequality between the classes. Her succession was controversial, as her son Paul I took the throne, but in a very different manner from his mother, being more authoritarian and unpopular among the nobles. Catherine was buried with great pomp, but the story of her life continues to be debated, particularly because of her reforms her style of government, and her controversial personal relationships. She was a woman who challenged the norms of her time and left a lasting legacy that would be remembered for centuries. Catherine the Great left a legacy that would echo through the centuries. Her ability to expand Russia, her cultural reforms, her contributions to art and education, and her prosperous empire made her one of the most influential figures in world history. However, her legacy is also marked by the social issues she failed to address, especially serfdom, which would continue to haunt Russia well into the 19th. Despite criticism of her lack of decisive action regarding serfdom and social inequality, Catherine was an innovative monarch who advanced Russia on several fronts. She led the country to become a military power and a cultural reference in the world, promoting the Enlightenment in a unique way and applying it in a pragmatic way that suited the reality of the empire. Catherine's legacy is not just about military achievements or administrative reforms, but also about the impact she had on how power could be exercised by a woman in a male-dominated world. She proved that willpower, intelligence, and political skill could overcome gender expectations, creating a model of leadership that would be remembered and studied for generations. Today, Catherine is remembered as one of the greatest empresses in history, and her reign continues to be a landmark in the history of Russia and Europe. She not only ruled Russia, but also transformed it, and her impact lives on, not only in the pages of history, but also in the culture and politics of the modern world. If you were fascinated by the story of Catherine the Great and want to learn even more about great monarchs and historical moments, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like and share this video with your friends. And of course, don't forget to comment on what you thought of Catherine's story and which part impressed you the most. Your opinion is very important to us. See you in the next video with more incredible stories about power, politics, and great moments in history. See you then.